Welcome to another delightful episode of Words, Images, and Worlds. On this episode, I'm glad to be having a second conversation with creator, artist Austin McKinley. Austin, thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Glad to have you. Glad to have you. The last time you were on, this was a trio talk. We had Dirk Manning on with us. I believe he came
Right.
in sort of in the bat form that he sometimes takes. And we were talking about your collaboration there with him. But on this episode, we are talking about a book that is your brainchild, and that is Stellarator. And this is also a crossover into the video game world. So lots of interesting points of fandom to talk about.
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a fun kind of hybrid project. It's the creation of the game influenced the plot that ultimately became the whole story for the graphic novel, and the graphic novel sort of takes somewhat from the game too in terms of its visual iconography. So yeah, it was a really interesting. I've never put together a project quite that way before. Doing a game and a comic in tandem and letting them influence each other as I'm building them.
Yeah. Um, Anything you'd like to share about your history with gaming? Because I know when I was growing up, it was like the Atari was somewhere because that was already in the house. But
Yep,
then I would sort of get game systems handed down from cousins. So Nintendo was there somewhere, Game Boy.
yep.
I think my first official system that was just mine originally was the Sega Genesis. So
Okay,
I've spent my days blowing off cartridges and sore thumbs from snow days and stuff like that. So what was your
absolutely.
introduction to gaming?
They were kind of in the background when we were growing up. There were arcade machines at pizza places and uh,
Hmm.
different consoles at friends' houses and such like this. My first console was the NES, the gray box. Um, and I had an experience, probably like a lot of kids our age, where that was the first time you really got to sit down and spend time in a world that you were exploring virtually. Like when you're pumping quarters into a machine at an arcade, it's not the same experience.
Hmm.
Legend of Zelda, no matter how many times you died, you could just play it indefinitely um, until you discovered new things. And so it was a very different gaming experience. And I think that there's a lot about um, what games became that really started, certainly home entertainment games that started with that era of the NES.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely, definitely. Was comics something that kind of lived alongside games for you? Was that something that kind of
Um,
interacted?
well, when I was a kid, certainly the idea of making my own video game was not even anywhere on the radar. Like
Yep.
they were part of our uh, fantasy lexicon, I would say. Obviously the game worlds influenced um, our creativity and the sort of narratives that we would develop for ourselves. But pencil and paper was what we had to create with. And so for me, comics was my first language. I was not making video games as a teenager. I was making mini comics and printing them at Alpha Graphics and selling them to my friends.
Yeah. Yeah.
so, so the making video games was a later in life proposition. Um, but once I got into it, the capability for doing world building and creating a space that people can not just um, explore and see how clever the creators are, but also find their own way of exploring things. That one of the things that we discovered when we did our documentary, The New 8-Bit Heroes, that's about the homebrew development scene and why people still create for a 30-year-old system, was that video games are more akin to playing music than they are to watching a movie or creating a painting or something like this. It's something rhythmic, it's something tactile, that you participate in. Um, and so, the opportunity to create worlds that people can not just explore but take ownership of, and feel like they've had a not just feel like they've had, but actually have an experience. There's neuroscience to show that uh, experiences we have in the virtual world are everywhere, every bit as real to us as real experiences, and that's true of stories too, to some degree. Like when you are experiencing a story through someone else's eyes, there's a part of you that says, "This happened to me."
Yeah, yeah. There can't not be a storytelling aspect to video games, right? There's some
Absolutely,
kind of
yeah,
conquer, there's
yeah.
a hero. Usually you're the protagonist, but you're also embodied in some
Hmm.
way, and then you're trying to accomplish something in the game. So there's really fascinating story work that takes place there.
Absolutely. And even, I mean, even very simple games, I feel imply a certain amount of narrative question. Even if we're talking about Cubert, why is he on a pyramid? Why are there snakes? I don't know,
Hmm.
but it's interesting to ask the questions.
Yeah, yeah. So how did the story come together for Stellarator? Anything that you'd like to say about kind of the premise, the pitch that listeners should know about?
So Stellarator revolves around Rake Bravo, who is a rogue intergalactic performance artist who steals rich people's stuff and does stupid things with it for social commentary. Uh,
Nice.
and he, after one of these sorts of stunts, he winds up on Earth with his spaceship out of gas, more or less, and has to enlist the help of a Florida bartender and a fugitive ex-union organizer from the spaceship building planet to get back into space. But then once he does, he's obligated to help them with their issues, and complications ensue, and he discovers a vast galactic conspiracy, as you do.
Yes, yes. That's and that kind of also speaks to the science fiction worlds that come together in games like this. It also speaks to kind of the grand storytelling that you can do.
For
Just
sure.
lends itself to that kind of world building.
Mm-hmm. I've always been a fan of space opera. I like cartoon space, especially. Like uh, one of the things that I was surprised to discover when I was doing my first graphic novel, Riot Force, which was based on some of those ideas that I came up with when I was 9 years old, um, and revisiting as an adult, and re-examining, um, was that it was just so fun. Like I
Hmm.
never got tired of doing it. On the day I did the last page of that book, I'm like, I'm still having just as much fun as I did when I started. And dare I say, drawing cartoon space is even more fun.
Nice, nice.
So yeah, it's just it's a place of joy for me.
Yeah. What did moving from like video game creating to the comic open up for you creatively? Like, what did it add to that process for you? Do you feel like based on like previous experiences you've had?
Mm. One of the things that I think is super interesting about doing a comic book that is influenced by a video game, is especially a NES game, is that the graphics are so simplistic. You have to communicate ideas using 16 pixels wide by 32 pixels high. That
Hmm.
has to look like something evocative enough that your imagination can take over and layer onto that narrative a sense of uh, self and context for what's going on. And so when I have to be so uh, economical in terms of my design for the game world, it actually makes it incredibly easy to then zoom out to a comic book level with a much greater amount of uh, potential creative granularity. But I'm using this iconography that still works even when it's microscopic. So I think it really gives the comic book world a sense of clarity that uh, it wouldn't otherwise have because it's coming from this very rudimentary and almost abstract source material.
Yeah, yeah. What were some of the important aspects of like games and game design that you made sure to bring into the book?
Um, it's a good question. One of the things that I was surprised to learn about game design when I started programming for the NES was that uh, it didn't actually matter how the game looked. What mattered
Mm-hmm.
was that it was fun to play. You know, you had even in the NES era games that were very graphically sophisticated, like Battletoads, say, um, that weren't particularly fun to play. They were so difficult because they made all these concessions to the graphic requirements of the game that the mechanics were uh, not as developed. And even games that I thought were sort of graphically simplistic when I was a kid, and even starting to look at what does my NES game look like, you know, something like Metroid, the fact that it is flat on, the fact that it is somewhat rectangular in its presentation, and that the it's populated by characters that work as sprites first, and
Mm-hmm.
uh, what that may suggest in terms of the overall world building is kind of follows on from what works in a very small scale. So that sense of mechanics first design for the game uh, is sort of different than what you do when you're drawing a comic book, because you're like, I think this would look cool, or I think this gets us from point A to B. This sort of explains the story. Um, but to answer your original question, I think the thing from game design that I brought into the comic is trusting my audience to make it their own. You know, like
Mm-hmm.
creating enough of a framework to put them in a place, but then what they sort of read into that, you know, all the subtext, all the implications of the wider world outside the narrow focus of the story. Um, there should be enough hooks for them to hang that on to expand in their mind. Um, but it's basically just trying to tread lightly with the narrative, you know.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I think I got the most out of game design to comic book development. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. What was it like to be working on this project with SourcePoint, with Dirk, and the creative team there?
Well, we haven't done a whole lot of cross collaboration on this particular project. He's been a huge supporter of it early on. You know, like pretty much as soon as I finished Riot Force, you know, he was like, "What's next? You need to have something next. You know, don't just
Mm-hmm.
stall out. You know, you've got momentum here. So what's the next thing?" And I'm like, I think it needs to be Stellarator. I think that's uh, you know, the most interesting and rich source material that I have to pull from for my next project. So yeah, he was very supportive in that way in encouraging me to keep it going.
Yeah, yeah. And I imagine he's also encouraging the next project and creative layout to
There's
come.
Yeah, for sure. There's always a pipeline of sometimes of some kind. Things jump the queue or rearrange. You know, it's somewhat nebulous, but yeah, we're always talking about what's next.
Yeah, yeah. If I'm a listener and I want to find out more about your work, if I want to support this project or anything else that you have coming down that pipeline, any places that I should go?
AustinMcKinley.com is my website. I try to keep that more or less up to date with with happenings. Um, right now, follow me on socials, and you will not fail to be bombarded with references to the Stellarator project as it is developing. Stellarator is all hand drawn, ink on paper, uh, colored the same way I've been doing for decades. It's a
Mhm.
very traditional process that I'm well rehearsed in, um, and uh, programming for the NES is similar in that it's a process other than our software, which does facilitate someone who isn't first a coder like me. Um,
Mhm.
I'm never going to write my own game engine, but using our NES Maker software, I'm able to back creatively into my project and then, call in my ringers if I get stuck on something because I can edit code, but I'm not going to uh, reverse engineer how to uh, field an entire NES game from the ground up. That's not in my wheelhouse. So, but the similarity between the traditional artwork and the programming like they did in 1985 is
Mhm.
is that there are no shortcuts to making art. It's always something that comes out of the process. It's a thing that you arrive at by doing it. And so, if the way that I approach it seems inefficient or a bit of a throwback, that is on purpose. That is something that I feel the value in creating the work is doing the line mileage and discovering what comes out of it.
Yeah, yeah. It's very cool that you cross over with both of those worlds. I know people that do comics, and I know people that are very passionate about coding and gaming, but love that you forged some connections between those two areas.
Well, it helps to have great collaborators, and I've been very fortunate in uh, having business partners like Dirk Manning and like Joe Granato who uh, challenge me to uh, stretch myself creatively and enter arenas that I wouldn't necessarily have found the motivation to enter without their support.
Yeah, yeah. Very cool. The creative community. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Austin, glad to talk with you on this episode. I'm glad that we had the chance to connect. We got to see each other briefly in person at C2E2, so
Mm-hmm.
glad to exist there as well. And the invitation is always open if you want to come back and talk in the future about other projects.
Thank you so much for having me.